Hi, in this second video in the series on securing Azure environments, we are going to continue from where we left off in the first one. If you remember from the first one, we went ahead and looked at a PowerShell script that can be used to audit the environment and understand which practices you're following and which practices you've probably missed out. If you haven't seen it already, please go ahead and click on the link at the end of this video to go through that, because that'll give you some context about what we're doing here. Now, in the first video, we saw how I hadn't enabled any of the security features that I had, and what we're going to do in this video is go through the different things that you need to enable. And as a refresher, I've gone ahead and just listed all of it here in this PPT. So if you look over here, when you're working with Azure SQL databases, which is what we were covering in the first video, you need to go ahead and enable audits so that you can identify who the culprit is when some infiltration happens. You also need to go ahead and enable threat detection, because that is an AI enabled feature of Azure that will help you identify connections originating from IP addresses that probably haven't ever been used or are suspect, as well as a number of other threat patterns like denial of service attacks, etc. The most important and probably the most basic is again configuring firewalls, and again here you have database level firewalls and server level firewalls. The one that we'll be showing in this video is server level firewalls, which come inside of Azure, and for database level firewalls I have a link which you can visit at the end of this video. And last but not least, you've got cell level encryption, always encrypted. These are again features internal to the database engine. So if you think about it, the first, second and third ones are stuff that you do inside of Azure, and the last one is something that you do to your data. So without any further ado, let's have a look at how we can secure Azure SQL databases. And for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, create a new server, a new database, and then start securing it. So you can see what comes with a standard default setup and what are the stuff that you need to do on top of it to further strengthen your security infrastructure. Great. So first things first, we need to log into Azure, and once you're logged into Azure, you need to go ahead and create a new database. Again, most of you would be familiar with this step, but I'm just doing it so you can see the difference between what comes by default and what you need to do in addition. So after you click databases, you choose your subscription. You can use a resource group. So I'm just going to create a new resource group calling it security, because I just want to go ahead and demonstrate this. So once it's done, I'm going to get rid of this. Again, I'll call this database security as well. And you will create a new server. Again, you don't need to if you already have one, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new server so I can get rid of it at the end of the day. So I'm just going to call this guy EBS secure, and the server login name, I'm just going to call this guy test admin, and I'm going to give the password it's usually a bit good practice to create a server locally or close to where you reside, so that network latency and things like that don't become a factor. As you can see here, I've gone ahead and typed in the required details, and now that that's done, when I click OK, I'm going to get a server provisioned for me using this name, and with the this would be what you would call your equivalent of an SA login, this one here. So obviously SA can't be granted, and as a result you need to create a separate login, which for all purposes would be like an admin for you. I press OK, and once that's done, I have a new server that will be provisioned for me. Elastic pool is again a performance criteria that we look at so that we can make sure that the server that we're configuring has the sufficient amount of resources available to work with the load that we intend to deploy on it. Since this is a demonstration, I'm just going to use the most basic provision available, so that's the basic, and that's pretty much it. Again, networking, there is something that you want to go ahead and do over here, but that's going to be more clear when we talk about virtual machines. You can see that by default the connectivity method says no access, so that makes sure that nobody from outside the network can connect to your environment. Additional settings, do you want backups? Well, yes, obviously. backups happen automatically, but in this case what happens is you can choose an existing backup file that you might have loaded into your Azure storage account, or if you're just playing around you can use a sample. Collations, again, SQL Latin General 1, you'll see that it's SQL collations and not Windows collations. And enable advanced data security. This is a paid feature that you need to go ahead and enable. But I guess in the interest of showing you, I could probably start a free trial. And you'll see that when I do that, it creates a storage account where the vulnerability assessments are stored, especially when you're using scripting like PowerShell, etc. All done, so I'll go ahead, press create, and once this is deployed, we will be ready to talk about how these things can be used to work with SQL Server, and how to make sure that SQL Server is secure at the end of the day. Great, so after I've gone ahead and pressed create, it takes a few minutes for the deployment to actually go through, and once it's done, what you'll see is if you click on SQL databases, you'll see the database that you created as well as any other existing databases that you might have. You'll also see that the UI has changed a little bit, so you'll see that we've got some new SQL resource browser which gives you a more holistic view of all your database infrastructure that you have inside of Azure. In this case, the security EBS/security is my SQL database, and then EBS secure is my SQL server, as you can see by resource type. So the first thing I want to do is I want to secure the server. So I'll go ahead, click on secure EBS secure. And when I do that, again, we've got a number of options here, and we don't need to get into the details of all of them. But the first one that we needed to do was, as you can see here, auditing. You'll also see here that transparent data encryption. You can see that it's in green because it's already enabled, but on the other hand, auditing is not enabled. You'll also see when I click the option for enable advanced security, that actually got configured on its own and created a storage account for me where details of information that it identifies as relevant to security gets dumped over there. So let's do this. Let's get started with transparent data encryption. The master database is never encrypted using TDE, but your user databases will be encrypted using TDE, so that's something that you want to go ahead and be aware of. You can also see here that right now what's being done is that a service managed key, a key that was created by Azure, is what is being used for encrypting my data and transparent data encryption. Not that really it matters, because for all purposes TDE is basically an encryption of the MDF LDF files, and those files are not accessible to you anyways, so it's not like you can get a copy of that and then restore it locally, and at that point you'd need the key. However, having said that, if you feel you need to, especially for example when you are restoring a backup from your local environment into Azure, you might need to provide your own key, and that's where the key vault comes into picture. We're going to be talking more about the key vault when we start talking about operational security with regard to things like connection strings, etc. So as you can see, by default TDE is enabled, so that's good for us. We don't really need to do anything extra over there. The next one is advanced data security, which as you can see I enabled it at the time of creation of the database. If you haven't done that, all you need to do is come over here under security, click and say on. When you do that, naturally you have your subscription and you need to create a storage account. Ideally, I recommend using an existing storage account. The reason is because these are not the only things you will be auditing. You will also be auditing things like virtual machines, etc. And it's a good idea to have the logs all in one place so that it's easier for you to correlate information coming from different environments. Having said that, recurring periodic scans is on, and again, whenever a scan detects an anomaly, you might want an email sent out to you. So you could do something like jayanth.kurup@gmail.com, and again, the same thing you can do for the advanced threat protection settings as well. You'll see at the moment, because I enabled everything by default, you'll see that the advanced threat protection type is all. And let's go ahead and explore what are the different types of threat protection that it protects us against. You'll see that by default we've got SQL injection, and SQL injection vulnerability basically goes through your code to identify if there is a possibility that SQL injection can happen. Data exfiltration is obviously when someone is extracting data from your environment. Unsafe actions could be any kind of action that compromises the security, such as granting unnecessary privileges or using weak passwords, etc. And anomalous client login is basically any login originating from a region or IP address that is identified as being harmful. So standard stuff pretty much, and again, this is not comprehensive, so when it says advanced, you still need to understand that there are many other ways that your database and your servers can be compromised. Microsoft is doing maybe about 60% or 70% of the basic stuff that you need to watch out for. Having said that, there are other ways that people can infiltrate your network, so you need to be clear about that. Just enabling this is not going to be the complete solution, but it is a very good place to start. The next thing that we want to worry about, as you can see here, it says enable auditing for better threat investigation experience, and that's something that we haven't done. So I'm going to go ahead and press auditing, and you'll see that when I do auditing, it's disabled by default. So the first thing I want to do is I want to enable it, and I want to say that the logs, again, this is basically like your event viewer or your audit logs. So I want to go ahead and dump my audit details into a storage account, and luckily for me, I have a storage account created for me when I created the advanced threat detection, or when I enabled advanced threat detection. So I'm just going to reuse that one. And you can see here that it's asking for retention days. If you set 0, it basically means unlimited, but I don't want unlimited. I'm going to say that I guess about a year's worth of audit details should be good enough. Well, if you don't identify a problem within a year, then probably there's bigger problems that you need to worry about. And that's pretty much it. So as you can see, it's fairly straightforward. All you need to go ahead and do is click a few buttons and press OK. Again, log analytics, event hub, these are other mechanisms that you can use to go ahead and fetch information or logging information and bring it all in one place for you, so you can have a more holistic view of your environment. And these are the stuff that you want to do at the server level. So these are basically enabled for all databases inside of that server. So these are basically your first level of prevention against any security issues. You also have firewalls and virtual networks, which is kind of like the big one that I wanted to talk to you about. As you can see, by default, only the IP address that you're currently using when you created the database is what is enabled. Later on, especially when you're working from home or some other environment, we typically go ahead and click add client IP, or we specify a range of IPs. The absolute no-no here is to do something like this, where you basically say 0.0.0.0, which enables all IP addresses to access your database. So the first thing as a DBA that you want to do is talk to your network administrator and identify IP addresses that need to connect to your database. Or more specifically, if you're using Azure infrastructure, find out the IP address of your virtual machine and only enter that IP address in here. With that, you would be fairly secure as far as securing your database is concerned. In addition to that, you can see we also have an option called create a virtual network, and what this does is you can have a dedicated virtual network, a VPN connection between your virtual machine and your Azure SQL database, so that the network connection between them is ultra secure and doesn't really have anything that is using the common Azure infrastructure, so to speak. So what this does for you is that it's kind of like building your own network inside of Azure, which gives you a lot more control over the traffic of the network. And this becomes very useful, especially when you have a lot of infrastructure in one place. So you got your virtual machines, you got your websites, you got your application layer, you got your business layer, you got your presentation layer, you got your data layer, and you want all of these guys to be able to talk in a very self-contained unit, and that's where the virtual network will come into picture, which we will talk about when we start talking about virtual machines. And that's pretty much it as far as securing these guys are concerned over here inside of Azure, the SQL Server. Next, we're going to look at what you need to do inside of the database. Private endpoint connection, again, is a dedicated endpoint, which we will again talk about when we start creating private endpoints using virtual networks. Now that we've finished exploring what are our security options at the server level, the next stop is understanding what we need to do at the database level. A lot of DBAs usually skip out the database level because with the rise of DevOps, the assumption is that the developer is sufficiently aware of what they need to do. However, in my experience, time and again, I've seen that the developers focus mainly on the programmatic access and the code and the functionality rather than the important aspects of security that you need to keep in mind when you work with databases in Azure. So the first and foremost thing is you need to get into databases and identify the database that you want to secure. So in my case it's called security. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. After I do that, under security you'll see that we've got advanced data security, auditing, dynamic data masking, and transparent data encryption. Let's start off with transparent data encryption. As you can see here, it's enabled by default, so there's nothing that we need to do there. The next one is dynamic data masking. Again, this is not as secure as encryption, but it's a good way of masking important information that you want to hide from end users. If you want more details about how dynamic data masking works, I highly recommend that you visit my website, and in my website you'll see the blog, and under blog there is a section called dynamic data masking. When you click on it, it gives you information about how to create tables with dynamic data masking. It explains to you what are the stuff that you need to be aware of and how to use it. Having said that, there are other features also that I will show you in a minute. Next thing is auditing. Now you might wonder why we have auditing here when we've already enabled it at the server level, but if you're working with SQL Server, you'll know that we have server level audits as well as database level audits, and this one is specific to the database that we are currently looking at. So you'll see that even though the server level auditing is enabled, the database level audit is disabled, and that's what we need to work on next. So I'll go ahead and click on, I'll choose storage, and like I mentioned in a few minutes back, that the best thing you can do is kind of put it in a secure environment where you already have control and you've set it up to monitor and your storage account is available. You can use roughly about the same retention period as what you do for the server level, and then you'll go ahead and press OK, and that takes care of auditing at the database level. The last thing that you want to look at is advanced data security, which is again the features that we talked about, which happen at the server level. You'll actually see how much this particular database contributes to the overall threat assessment for your server. So it's mostly just feedback report about how this database stands as far as security is concerned. If you click settings, you can see that we can say enable advanced data security at the database level, and all the remaining stuff remains the same. So you've got the same level of checks that you want to watch out for. So you can see that I've got SQL injection, vulnerability, data exfiltrations, unsafe action, and anomalous client login. And so again, you want to go ahead and do that at the database level. Typically server level should be good enough because it does the at the whole server level, but if there is some particular database that you're forced to expose to the public, maybe for some third-party client interaction, then it makes sense for you to go ahead and do it even at the database level. So with that, we are pretty much done with all the buttons that you need to click inside of Azure, but I would be remiss if I didn't show you some of the other stuff that you will need to do when you're working with databases inside of cloud like environments, and this is again common to Azure as well as AWS. So last but not least, we're going to look at how to enable always encrypted, or how to work with always encrypted. Again, I highly recommend that you come to my website and type in always encrypted in the search window, and you'll find step-by-step instructions on how to go about setting up and configuring always encrypted. And with that, we've covered pretty much all the basic security measures that you need to be following when you work with Azure, and more specifically Azure SQL databases. In the next video, we'll be talking a little bit about virtual machines and what you need to do to secure them as well. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and thank you for watching.